Good evening. Welcome to Mother, Daughter, Sister Spy. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you so much to our host committee sponsors, AT&T and Carasoft. We could not survive without sponsors like you, so thank you so much for your support. We have a really stellar moderator and fantastic panel of speakers tonight. Our moderator is Laurie Stokes. She's co-anchor of Good Day New York on WNYW-TV, Fox 5, and she is a Spy Museum Governing Board member. Hi, Laurie.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi. We have Amy S. Hess, former FBI Executive Assistant Director with FIRST Science and Technology Branch, and later the Criminal Cyber Response and Services Branch. Hi, Amy.
Good evening.
We have Lieutenant General Mary Legere, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence of the United States Army. Hello, Mary.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Dr. Jung H, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer at the National Intelligence Council in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Hi, Jung.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Karen M. Schaefer, former CIA Operations Officer in Latin America, Europe, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and she is a Spy Museum Advisory Board member. Hi, Karen. And last but not least in any way, Debra Evans Smith, former Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterintelligence Division at FBI headquarters. What a panel of incredible people we have here tonight. Laurie is going to be asking a variety of questions, and then we plan to leave a little time for audience Q&A. So enough of me, over to you, Laurie Stokes, and this fantastic panel.
All right, Amanda, once again, thank you so much, and welcome to all of the people who are tuning in to us and those who plan to. It's very exciting to be with this wonderful group of very accomplished women. Last week, I was interviewing Gloria Steinem about a new movie coming out about her, and it starts when she's 5 years old. And I thought to myself, how many of us really think of Gloria Steinem when she was 5 years old, now that she's 86. So for all we know about the accomplishments of all of you ladies, I just want to take you back to when you were 5 years old and how you became the woman that you are now. I want to start with you, Mary. I know that you were born in New York, grew up in New Hampshire, 4 brothers, and that your mother really never made it a point to say, you are a girl, therefore this is how you are supposed to behave. So tell us briefly about your path.
Yeah, so that's probably the most important start for a panel like this, is to have a mother that brings you in through birth and circumstances into your first tribe and says, this is gonna be a gender neutral family, and you are going to be able to aspire and be expected candidly to go after your your goals and aspirations in the same way your brothers are. There was no, and the joke the family likes to tell is, when you are with 4 brothers in a Catholic family and there's discussion about priests. I was 7 when they let me know, and the priest let me know. He said, what would you like to be when you grow up? And I thought, well, I'll go for the gusto and really suck up here. And I said, well, Father, you do some really good things for the world. I think I'd like to be a priest. And he shoots me sort of this horrifying look, and then gently recovers, and he said, well, you could be a nun. You could give, you could do that. And I just looked at him and said, oh, Father, I couldn't wear those shoes. And so he never forgot that, because years later, as my mother and father, who remained very close to him, would send pictures and letters about their daughter, the Army officer, he just got a great kick out of the fact that as a 7-year-old, it was a fashion choice that led me down a path. But I do think that start of a mother that basically was very conscious in the world, that she grew up in. My mother was born in the 30s. She was an extremely talented woman in her own right, a leader in our community, a teacher. She wanted to make sure I didn't see the limitations that I might presume. And she always would things like, I've sort of raised you to take your place in the world. And if you can survive your childhood with your brothers, because there was actually no rule about not hitting your sister, which I told my dad. He said at some point we did do that, not because we just didn't want your brothers to hit anybody, but we didn't want to go to the orthopedics too much with you. But I think that message of you can accomplish whatever you are willing to work for. She liked that saying, preparation, plus opportunity creates that success or creates that luck. And she really just encouraged me to try as many things that interested me and assured me I would find the path that would excite me and give me the life that I was looking for. So I'm just grateful for that start.
All right, Jung, let's go to you. And all of you should keep in mind as you're telling us about your childhood, this is resonating with a young person who's watching today. They are seeing a reflection of themselves as you speak. So keep that in mind, Jung.
Thanks, Lori. Mary, that was awesome. This is a more personal question than I've ever received, doing these panels. And when I look back on when I was 5, there was no really gendered view of what myself and my sister would turn out to be, because both of our parents worked all the time and we were let loose. I mean, we were free range kids from the very beginning. And this was also, when I was 5, I was also in Seoul, South Korea, where I was born. And we immigrated by the time I was 7. And I think that's where my love of just kind of being untethered, learning different things and poking my hand in a bunch of different things that I'm not supposed to. And that desire to learn everything about everything there is. And being an immigrant myself, to see how ideas and how people are transplanted to a different part of the world and how those ideas travel and what that means for that country or for that for the trajectory of that person's life or people's life. So I think I point my desire to learn everything I can about international relations, foreign policy, transnational issues, really go back to when I was a free range kid running around in South Korea.
Okay. And Amy, I know you wanted to be an astronaut. That didn't really quite work out, but look at what you did anyway and what you accomplished. So take us back to your childhood.
Yeah, so I grew up in a suburb of Louisville, Kentucky, which is actually where I live now. And I just remember back, much like Mary was talking about, is my parents just never told me I couldn't do something, is that something was off limits, is that, I wasn't allowed to consider a career in this or that. And so the sky was the limit. And I just, in addition to that, I was the youngest of 5 children. So I had a lot to live up to. And in addition, I grew up in a neighborhood full of boys. So if I wanted to have any type of a semblance of friends or a social life, then I needed to get used to an environment where I was the only girl. And so I think all of those things together really helped me in my career and throughout my life. But yeah, the astronaut thing, Sally Ride was my hero when I was when I was in school, and I just thought it would be so cool to be an astronaut and to be associated with the space program. And so my guidance counselor said that, well, you should go for it. And I ended up pursuing a degree in aerospace engineering at Purdue, which was in-state tuition, so my dad loved it. And so, but in addition, it taught me that, really don't close yourself off to anything that you think might be possible. And ultimately, I didn't go that route. I ended up going into the FBI, and 20 years later in the FBI, they realized I had an engineering degree, and they said, we should probably put you in charge of a technology thing. But it all comes back around, and like I said, it was just the sky is the limit. I didn't have anybody who would say no.
Debra, do you want to go ahead?
I grew up right smack in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the middle of 3 girls. My older sister's 1 year older, and my younger is 1 year younger. So I was really the middle child. I was an adventurous and adventurous kid with a huge imagination. We grew up we were the last house on the dead end street, and below us was just woods. And I would go down into those woods and just play alone and do all sorts of things. You would think I'd probably grow up to be a scientist. I would make potions in the spring and then potions in the fall. And I had a little igloo made of leaves that I would go sit underneath and just sit there by myself. You would never let your kids do those things these days, because I think I would be gone for hours just doing my own thing and running around. But I always say that I had a wonderful, wonderful childhood. I remember my mother telling all three of us many times that we could do anything that we wanted to do in life, and no limitations. We did have a lot of rules that we had to follow. The main rule was that you never leave your sister behind. So we always had to do everything together. I come home from school, if one got, because there were sometimes fights in the neighborhood. If your sister got into it with someone, you would get in trouble if you left your sister. So my older sister got into it, I would say probably once a week with someone, and I was always the one fighting the battles for her. But it was a great childhood, and I did always believe in what my mother said, that you can do anything that you put your mind to doing. I never forgot that, and I always did.
I just want to start getting into some of the news stories that are happening right now and what your take is as we move forward, because there is a lot going on, particularly 1 week away from the presidential election. And last week, the director of the National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, and other top officials from the intelligence community made an announcement about the upcoming election. Ratcliffe said, and I quote, "We would like to alert the public that we have identified that 2 foreign actors, Iran and Russia, have specific actions to influence public opinion relating to our elections." Went on to say that these actors will try to cause confusion and chaos. Although we don't know exactly who's behind them, we certainly know what happened in 2016 with Russia. So as I said, 1 week away from the election, as Americans, are our votes threatened? June?
Thanks, Lori. This is such an important issue, and I think what we're looking at here when we talk about foreign interference is that when I look at this issue, I think about it in terms of how do we make ourselves more resilient to disinformation, and how do we have a people, a citizenry that can understand and have a critical thinking about what types of information is out there. And I see the intelligence community as being part of that front line and making sure and protecting the public, to make sure that that the analysis that is presented is one of speaking truth to power, which is what we have in the lobby of the Central Intelligence Agency, and that we've taken all of that information and be able to provide an assessment that about and serve the public in terms of how we should look at some of these foreign threats. I would say that some of the foreign interference threats include China, Russia, Iran, North Korea is also in there. But I think it's also important to note that they have different levels of capabilities and different intentions. And I think that's something that we have to be very careful as we assess and as we look at the levels of the variety, the wide range of threats that face our nation today.
Anyone else who would like to add to this?
Yeah, just this is Amy. So in my last job in the FBI, I got to oversee, among other divisions, our cyber division. And so one of the things that struck me, this was during the midterms, and so one of the things that struck me was that there's so much effort going to ensure infrastructure protection. We work very closely, FBI does, of course, with all of the IC. But DHS and CISA in particular are trying to make sure that these systems are hardened in such a way. The other thing that's at our advantage is that the infrastructure for elections is decentralized. so that there's, there would have to be a very organized attack in order to infiltrate or in order to be able to gain access to any particular system. But that said, much like Jung was just talking about the disinformation and the attempts out there, the problem is that if these foreign adversaries can put the thought in your mind that there is a potential, there's a possibility that a system could be compromised, then clearly that does as much damage sometimes as the real thing. And really that's the intent, right? Is to make you question the validity or question the integrity of the voting process. And that's something that's much harder to, we can have all the best technologists in the world trying to shore up our systems and ensure that we have the best security, but it's that disinformation piece and how do we combat that?
And yeah, Lori, I think the thing I'd say is, I listen to the intelligence professionals still serving who have such an important role right now, and to assure the American public that every measure is being taken. But we as citizens have responsibility, and Jung spoke to the first of it, which is to be aware of the use of information and disinformation. But also, one of the pillars of a democracy is your profession, the role of the fourth estate, bringing objective journalism to us, and then being a good consumer of that. And I can remember as a child, my father talking about a newspaper he really didn't want to come into the house. And his point was, it's actually not a newspaper in that it's a newspaper and it has a really good sports page, but actually they make no attempt at being fair and balanced. And he said, not all newspapers have a bias, but I want you to understand as a consumer, you have to understand there has to be an attempt to show both sides. And I can remember just as a child saying, but Dad, the sports page, we're on it. Can we just at least get the sports page? But I think we need to be better consumers of news. I think we need to understand when the media is under attack, our democracy, one of the pillars of democracy is also under attack. And I think we as citizens who value the democracy, in addition to actually supporting our intelligence community when it reports things that are difficult to consume, and we appreciate the efforts they have to secure the election and to make sure we're aware of what's happening, we need to be more discerning ourselves. And so that's our responsibility, to be civically involved and to make judgments and to understand, if you're consistently getting one side of the story, is that actually news, or is there something else going on?
I'll just dovetail, and hopefully I'm touching on a slightly different topic, because I would agree with Mary's comments, which I heard just the last bit of. And I would just simply say, I think the other responsibility that we have also is that so much of this is partnering with the private sector, because they are now, these media platforms, Facebook and whatnot, have to also, not only do private citizens have to assume a greater responsibility, but these private companies also have to assume a greater responsibility. They can't simply create a doorway for people to step through and then say that they are not responsible for who steps through that door. So I think the only thing I would add to that is that I do think that, and I think this is something that will naturally be addressed, but I also think that it's something that requires legislation and probably, certainly further discussion at the interagency in terms of how we manage that partnership, because it isn't enough to simply abdicate, or say you have no responsibility in helping rein in these platforms that are so, all of these, sites and whatnot that are spreading this disinformation.
Debra?
I'd just like to briefly add that I think the largest issue is the public and how they consume this information and what they make of it. And listening to all of the responses here on the panel from people who have backgrounds in intelligence and can discern sometimes what's true and what's not, and where information is coming from and possibly why. The general public doesn't see it that way. And so they're left to their own thoughts and the thoughts of other people to form how they're going to think about things. And in some ways it becomes dangerous because people tend to believe what they want to believe or believe things that are towards their own leanings. And that's a very difficult thing to battle, I think. And that's where we are in this country right now with so much disinformation out there and confusion. I think that's just a hard battle to fight and one that we all need to try and do a better job at. A lot of times we leave it to the media. It's not fully the media's job to do that, but I think it's the job of the intelligence community to try and do that also, to try to get the real information out to people with the hope that they will actually understand it and believe what they're saying.
Amy, I want to start with you on this next issue, particularly in your role as Chief of Public Safety for Louisville, Kentucky, and talking about Breonna Taylor and the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, Breonna Taylor being the 26-year-old Black medical worker who was shot and killed by Louisville police back in March. I know recently that you had testified in front of the Metro Council back in September about how the city was responding to the unrest. You said, I made mistakes that needed better communication responding down the road, and you're working with the mayor. But this is really amplified throughout the nation. And so I'm wondering, are there lessons that we're learning from this? The last time that we saw protests of this magnitude, whether it was from George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, was in the 60s. And we're all trying to get a grasp of it. And it is a learning lesson and a listening lesson. And so I'm looking to you, at least to start this conversation on this issue, because you're very close to it right now.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. So for one thing, look, policing is not going to look the same in the future, today or forward, as it did yesterday or last year. It is changing, and necessarily so, because I think this goes into the broader, we all served or serve in government. And I remember actually one of the things that we did in the FBI was something basically like a risk matrix, but it was to identify the branches in the FBI that posed the greatest risks. And it was important because to identify these things, because essentially to get better as a government, to get better as an agency, to be able to admit that there are things you need to improve, things that that we as government officials we're responsible for, and as accountable executives we're responsible for. And I remember, and I'm only slightly smiling, because of the top 10 things that our director at the time identified as the biggest risks in the FBI, 8 of them were in my branch, the science and technology branch. And I pointed that out to him, and I was like, well, this doesn't really seem fair when we have 6 branches and I have 80% of the highest risks. And he said, well, as it should be, because you have the scariest stuff. And I think back to that because it's not something we should shy away from, as far as acknowledging that there are risks associated with what we do. We are in a high-risk business in government, whether it's local government, state government, or federal government. We are in the risk game. And so for one thing, for us to put our head in the sand and pretend like we don't have risk, that we don't need to change, we shouldn't be learning from these things. Another thing, though, is to own it and to take responsibility. You mentioned this article, and I find it fascinating that people are very focused, or they were at the time of that hearing, that I seem to have been the only person who said that I've made mistakes. Yeah, I have. I don't know why that's so hard for other people to say, because we all have. And I think that we need to acknowledge that and own it and recognize that we need to use these experiences to now get better and to learn from them, and in order to improve the services that we provide to the public. And anyway, that's essentially, certainly where we are in society right now is recognizing that our systems need to change, and they continuously need to change, and we as leaders in our organizations should be focused on that.
Debra, I want to go to you because I know that Black women make up 1% of the FBI's special agents. You were with the FBI for 34 years. But you've also talked about in these instances that the FBI should send more minority representation to Kenosha, to Minneapolis, to Louisville, that you can improve upon the results during an investigation by sending in individuals that are a reflection of those who are in the trenches and being oppressed by a situation.
If you're going to, I worked civil rights for about close to 2 years during my career in the FBI. It was early on, but it gave me a good sense of how this violation works and the best way to do it. And in many ways, it's not so different from other violations. If you're going to talk to someone and if you're going to get information from them, you have to be able to relate to them. And what we're talking about with Breonna Taylor, with George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter, with police killings of African American men and women, we're talking about the African American or the Black community. And if we don't have enough agents in the FBI who can go out and relate to these individuals and sit down and talk to them, we're not going to really get the information that we should get. And we're not going to do the best job that we can do in that investigation. And I think in the end, that's what counts if you're looking at it from a law enforcement standpoint and from a civil rights standpoint and what the FBI should be doing. So there is definitely work to be done, serious work to be done in an attempt to increase the numbers. 1%, we've been around 1% for about 20 years. That is not acceptable. Not when the percentage rate of minorities is rising in this country. It should also rise in the FBI. And I'm not just focusing on the FBI, throughout the intelligence community, the US government, even the private sector. It's just no longer acceptable for that to be the case. And in order for that to change, we have to take deliberate steps to make it happen.
I'm curious with the upcoming election, if there's a shift in administration or if there isn't, and where we stand on a diplomatic level. Jung, I know that you have a book out, an insightful book about Kim Jong-un, and which you discuss the relationship that President Trump has with him, with their 2 summits and their meeting, and how they're very similar and how they flatter one another, and they get along a little bit too well, in fact. But I'm wondering whether it's North Korea or Israel or any other part of the world, do we risk some groundwork that's already been laid, or do we also take into account groundwork that's been laid by President Trump, or take into account that Joseph Biden was vice president for 8 years and had was a heartbeat away from many of these players and leaders in the first place as well? Would the balance be that jeopardized on the international level?
My view on some of the way of that foreign policy was being conducted is some of the hollowing out of the intelligence community, some of the silencing, some of the internalized, potentially some of the internalized censorship in terms of is the president getting the information that he needs to get? And there have been various reports about how President Trump didn't think that he needed to prepare. He didn't want to listen to, at the time, the director of national intelligence, Coates, who was saying different things about North Korea not not going to give up its nuclear weapons, and that that the country has continued to advance its nuclear weapons program. I think as an intelligence professional, you can take the girl out of the CIA, but you can't take the CIA out of the girl. We have these guardrails like the intelligence community and objective analysis coming out of the intelligence community and other government analysts to make sure that we check the president's, whether it's President Trump or Obama or anybody else, that we can check their biases, and that we can check their confirmation bias, we can check their anchoring bias, and that and that's one of the reasons that we have this big giant intelligence bureaucracy, to make sure that all of those ideas, that creativity, all of the evidence is put in a way that is helpful to any type of negotiations. And I guess what bothered me the most was the way that the president said he didn't need to prepare, and that he was not looking very kindly on some of the intelligence analysis that was coming out at the time in before these very important, unprecedented summits with Kim Jong-un.
Mary, can you add to this?
Yes. What I was thinking about was, the comment that are we going to have to reset the foreign policy? I think we would be at a loss to define what our foreign policy has been during this time frame, other than transactional and reactive. And when you have the position of leadership that the United States has had for so long, for reasons that are important, it's important with any administration. You would hope that the beginning of a new term, we would take a look at what is it that we're trying to accomplish, not only for the national interest of the United States, but for the good of the world. I wouldn't worry about a Biden administration trying to relive the heroics of 4 years ago. The world has moved on. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. We have a crisis in the health system around the world. There are so many things that can unite us at this point as we meet with world leaders to talk about real problems. And it seems like these visits have become transactional to see what success we can have to control a news cycle. So in my view, as someone that came into the intelligence community, sort of as someone that was interested in political science and national security, and found myself in those courses in college, this is serious business, and our place in the world is serious. And I think that we've had a void in consistency. If you're an ally or friend or adversary of us, you must wake up every day and try to figure out what the United States' position is. So I can only hope that, one, we restore the important institution of the State Department, which has had so many of its best Foreign Service officers leave, whose insights took 30 to 40 years to develop, and who have left the Foreign Service and aren't with us anymore. Perhaps some of them returned to government, but clearly in the intelligence community, we're having a conversation with the American people about the role of intelligence. And one of the things the Spy Museum does in its own charter is try to explain that. That was beginning to happen because of Snowden, and we sort of stepped back during this period of attack and the deep state. We have roles. So I'm looking forward to, I hope, a return to serious foreign policy where the United States contributes as a citizen to help advance solutions, whatever they choose to be, but stays coherent. And then the American people understand the direction we're taking. These trips to foreign leaders who have, agendas that are very different than the values of the United States, when we don't go in prepared. As someone that spent 10 years of her career in Korea, studying the Kim family and candidly the danger and oppression of those regimes. And it was fascinating to watch how there were no guardrails anymore. We were literally sitting down with a dictator that is going to be captured in history as one of the great dictators or despots in the world, who has brought great harm to his own people in addition to the region. So I'm hoping we return to some coherency, and I think it's important that we do that.
Karen, I don't know if you want to add, but I do also want to say I had watched an interview you did, Karen, Spy Chat, in which you talked about what keeps you up at night. And you talked about China keeping you up at night. And I don't know if it still is that case. This was pre-pandemic, and we didn't have all the information that we have, and we still have many mysteries around coronavirus and transparency and non-transparency. So you can, of course, elaborate on this if you want, but I wanted to pose a question since you had mentioned about what kept you up at night, China, if that still is.
Right. Before I step into that question, I would just want to double tap on everything that Mary said and Jung said. And I would also say, I think one of the things that those of us who have left government and have watched the deterioration and the public confidence, the loss of public confidence in a lot of our most important intelligence institutions, one of the things that I am extremely hopeful for is that there will be a restoration of the reputation of the intelligence community, you know, for what it's worth. And again, I'm obviously a veteran, 26 years in the agency, and my last stint was with FBI, so they are near and dear to my heart as well. But it's, you know, my experience is that regardless of what you may see in the press on a regular basis, that frankly, most people walk into their jobs with a completely apolitical approach. I know that seems crazy because the way that it is covered in the media, it certainly would suggest otherwise. But I can honestly tell you that it was not until very recently that I think this issue, I don't ever even remember discussing with my colleagues. I don't think I could tell you what their political affiliation was. And so I'm certainly hoping from my perspective that there's a return to normalcy in that context, because I think it has been hugely detrimental, not just to the efficacy of the institutions, but also to the morale of the folks that are working in these organizations. But having said all of that, and for, you know, hopefully there are lots of young women watching this show, I will say, I still think that it is one of the most exceptional careers, regardless of what agency, whether it's the CIA, whether it's FBI, whether it's the military intelligence. There are very few things, as Jung alluded to before. It is an extraordinary experience to know that the work that you're doing, you know, allows our policymakers to make informed decisions about our national security. And I hope that doesn't get lost in all of this, because yes, it's contentious, but you still, you know, 99% of the people in the intelligence community have their nose to the grindstone. They're keeping their heads down, and they're continuing to provide the intelligence and the analysis to the policymakers. Whether they choose to use that is a different issue that we could talk at great lengths about, but I do think that it's important on that point. And as for keeping me up at night, absolutely. China, in my book, is still number one. It continues. Their Belt and Road Initiative has been extraordinarily effective. They are stepping into economic voids that we've left. They are stepping into political voids that we have left. They are stepping into international fora where we used to lead and where we established the standards that were based on the value, as Mary alluded to before, post-World War II structure that was based on democratic values. As we have left a lot of these, whether it's, you know, reducing our role and spending in the UN, whether it's the WHO, whether it's any of these organizations, whether it's walking away from climate engagements, as we step out, they are more than happy to step in. And we may not see the repercussions of that immediately, but I can assure you that it will be devastating if we don't right-size their influence. And the idea that we can do that alone is also inconceivable. And one of the huge, one of the huge concerns I have is the impact on our closest alliances, because China does pose such an overwhelming threat to our national security and frankly to global security. And without our most critical partners, without our, being able to join forces and push back in a meaningful way, we don't stand a chance to confront China in a meaningful way.
So let's just pose that final question before we open it up to the audience. What keeps you up at night? Debra.
I think that recent events over the past several years have shown how vulnerable our democracy is, and it's still along the same lines of what Karen just said. We're truly divided as a nation, as divided as I've ever seen it in my lifetime. And also what struck me is how relatively, easily and quickly this has occurred. And this didn't happen over a course of 20 years. This is all recent activity, and we've taken such a change that quickly. And so what keeps me up about that is that not only is this internal to our nation, but this is revealed to the world. So they know how vulnerable we are. Our adversaries know exactly how vulnerable we are and how to hit us and how to hurt us. It's almost like this country has been weakened in a sense. And if I were an adversary of this country, I would be thinking, well, this is the time to strike, because they're no longer really united. And once those things go out of the window, and once our basic values and the idea of doing what's right simply because it's the right thing to do for the country and not for anyone else personally, those types of things we don't really see. We're moving away from that in a sense. Some are, not everyone, but some are. And I think that it's time for us to really reflect on those things and be careful about how we move forward in this country, because our vulnerabilities are really out there. And I think that should be enough to keep anyone up at night, the thought of us losing our democracy. And I don't know how close we are to doing that, and I don't know what the last straw would be for our democracy to break. But I think it's vulnerable and it's fragile, and if we lose that, I don't know where we would be as a country, and that's what keeps me up.
All right, Jung.
Thanks. Following up on what Karen and Debra said, I worry about that new normal, that this is the way government is supposed to be, or this is how societies are supposed to be organized. This is how U.S. leadership starts to contract. But what keeps me up at night is when I think about what are we handing down to our children, to our daughters and to our sons, and that's the climate crisis that we're currently living in. And so this is not a national issue, it's a transnational global issue, and it shows how we're all connected to each other. And the way the climate crisis applies to the intelligence community and to the national security apparatus, bureaucracy, is that scarce resources create wars and conflict. We have huge refugee crises already, and how is a worsening climate issue going to exacerbate those already bad human rights and refugee crises that we're experiencing today? The climate is going to just amplify a lot of the national security issues that we have currently, and we have to be really prepared to have those regional and functional mechanisms to address that.
Amy?
Yeah, I'd have to say that, the malign influence, the both foreign and domestic, just being able to discern fact from fiction. I will give you just a real quick 2 examples from the world I currently live in. Just in this past week, had 2 incidents. One, we had an individual, unfortunately, a young woman committed suicide, but it was put out on social media that the police shot her because they had shown up very quickly, and it was assumed that it was an officer-involved shooting, which created a huge response, and which almost actually turned bad. And in addition to that, just last week, we had another incident where it was reported that where we had shots fired in a local park that's been a centerpiece for the Breonna Taylor protests. Shots were fired in the area of that park, and it was put out on social media again that it was someone that it was not. And that created a huge response, again, that almost turned violent. And that worries me in the sense of course, just from a local response, but you exponentially compound that when we talk about the intelligence community and national security. When you talk about people not being able to discern fact from fiction, and to not be skeptical enough. But that's a balance too, right? Is that we have to learn to be skeptical, but too much skepticism may result in indecision and a paralysis. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night as to how do we get past that? How do we know fact from fiction? How do we source these things? How do we get better and faster at fact checking and at vetting?
And Mary, before we take our questions, what keeps you up?
Yeah, so those were all such pleasant thoughts to end our discussion with, but I think what I was writing down, because I anticipated that question, you've ticked the boxes of things. It begins with leadership. We cannot solve a problem if we don't acknowledge we have it. We have something happening that is creating the divisiveness in this country that is paralyzing our ability to find consensus on things that used to rally us to basically create response to. And yet there is a core middle in this country where when the neighborhood is stressed, they are out there helping each other. So there is good that we can tap into, but we need leaders that think beyond the transaction and think about what the country's going to be about and how we should respond. There's a solution in all of the problems that we've discussed, but we cannot stand by and be reactive in the world. All of the things that we just discussed about what keeps you up at night require a response that is based on the common good and mutual values, and we have to have those discussions again. So what keeps me up at night is when are we going to start having those conversations, and how soon can we start getting serious about finding solutions, going back to our great colleague, so that we hand the world off back to your children and their children, that is inhabitable and that is a place that inspires cooperation and problem solving. So I think it boils down to leadership at the end of the day.
All right. Well, I'm sure I know that some folks probably want to ask a couple of questions. It's funny because when I did the very first of one of these events 4 years ago, and we talked about such frivolous things, and the times have just changed. So, we were talking about, Matahari and women using, their sexuality, and that was it. We weren't talking on this kind of level, and I think that's indicative of really what we're dealing with. So I know, Mary, you thought it was a little bleak of what keeps us up at night, but we all have to face this reality of what we're dealing with.
I'm a Red Sox fan, so I'm born optimistic. It is impossible for me to stay negative too long. I will acknowledge the problem.
You're born in New York. How can you be a Red Sox fan?
Yeah, it's my dad. My dad was a New Yorker, and he was a Mets fan, and and a Dodgers fan. So I'm probably the only kid in New Hampshire that's read all the books on the Brooklyn Dodgers. I know everything about the Brooklyn Dodgers. My father swore.
We don't have a lot of time, but we do have a lot of questions. Okay. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Mary.
But I'm an optimist, though, Lori. We gotta end on good notes. We don't go to the bars and be gloomy.
We do have a lot of very young people watching this. Young teens, 12 and up. Anybody have what should a young woman who is interested in a career in the IC consider, studying? What skills should she be after? We always hear about languages. Is it still languages?
Who wants to tackle that?
I'll take
And
a
language.
first shot at it, and then everybody else can pile on. I would say definitely international relations, political science, study hard, get good grades. Travel is wonderful. Having the experience, intellectual curiosity about the world, about other people, other cultures, language, particularly the hard languages. So we're talking about Chinese, Arabic, Persian. Those are key things that they will look for to recruit folks. Obviously, when you get into the analytical side, having master's and PhD expertise in that realm also becomes really, really important.
Jung?
Thanks. Everything Karen said, plus it depends on what you want to do in the intelligence community, because the intelligence community is a world of, it's an alternate universe. We have architects, we have engineers, we have graphic designers. So it's not just the traditional clandestine work as well and the analysis, but it's also the science and tech and support. So there's a universe of things that are applicable in the intelligence community. I studied U.S. history. I've got my PhD in U.S. history, and looking at the progressive era of the 19th century. So I think it depends on it's more how you write, how you communicate. The learning and the subject matter expertise will come later, but I think you have to have those basic fundamental skills.
Amanda, is there another question?
Yeah, we are so pressed, but I know someone on this panel has a really cool answer to this question. Can someone share a story about whether they participated in a capture of a spy for an adversarial government? And I know someone here was involved in the Hansen.
You may be thinking about me, Amanda.
I sure am. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, and I'll try to be brief. I supervised the Robert Hansen investigation case. Participating in that case was extremely interesting and different. What made it different was that he was an FBI agent who was currently working in the FBI. He was detailed to State Department, but he still had all the accesses. He could still look at our computer systems, and he worked counterintelligence. In fact, he at one point supervised the analytic unit for Russian matters. And so he knew the targets, he knew how we operated, he knew all of our systems. So he was a hard target to go after, even some of the simple things that you usually do at the start of an investigation, like surveillance. We didn't know whether or not he had a radio. So that would give him access to listening to our folks. We could no longer use our computer systems because he had access, and he was somewhat of a computer expert himself. And he was mining the system, so we had to go back to paper. We couldn't put anything on the computer at all. So we had some challenges to start with in the investigation, and it took a little while to work around some of those things, but we were able to do it. And he'd been spying for so long, and had been so, I hate to use the word successful at it, but he basically was a successful spy for nearly 20 years. So I think he became a little complacent in some of the things he was doing and how he was operating, which gave us opportunities to and inroads to how we could actually catch him in the act, which ultimately we did, which was that's the best thing that you can do in an espionage investigation, is catch the subject in the act of committing espionage, which we were able to do prior to his arrest. But it was an absolutely interesting case. Big cases sometimes bring big problems and issues, and we had to deal with some of those also. Like the director of the FBI decided that we could no longer leave him at the State Department while we conducted the investigation. We couldn't leave an active spy out there working for somebody else. And without, I think Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State at the time, without telling her. So had to devise a reason to bring him back into the fold. And that reason was, I didn't come up with this reason, but I think it was at a much higher level to promote. So he was actually promoted while he was spying, so that we could bring him back into the FBI and out of another agency, but it gave us an opportunity to even watch him even closer. Interesting case. I'm glad it ended the way it did, and that it went off without a hitch. But it was a very intense time for everyone who worked it, and you couldn't. I mean, one of the biggest fears was that he would find out that we were actually investigating him, and some of the people who were working very closely on the case were friends that he would go to lunch with. And he even knocked on the door of an individual who was working in a vault at the time to ask him to go to lunch. And had the individual opened that door fully, he would have his pictures plastered all over the wall and information about him, all over the walls. So there were instances where we came that close, but he never found out about the investigation.
Well, Debra, thank you for sharing that. I know you each have incredible stories to tell, and it is my sadness that I'm the kind of person that has to say, but we're wrapping up now. This has been so incredible. Your insights, everyone on the panel, the moderator, cannot thank you enough for all your candor and your thoughts, and some of you, even your optimism. Thank you, Mary. I see you and your optimism. It's really, we couldn't do programs like this without our incredible host committee sponsors, AT&T and Carasoft. Your support means everything to us. If you're watching tonight and you would also like to support us, we'd be very gratified. We really thank you for everything you've done to keep us able to give programs during this very difficult time. We have a mission resilience campaign, and if you donate anything between now and the end of the year, it will be doubled. If you give us $1, we'll get $2. And we would appreciate anything you can do. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us tonight. Stay well, and thank you, incredible panel, for being so candid. We appreciate you.
Amanda, thank you everyone for tuning in.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.